I'll give you a little bit of a broader talk on perception and some of the recent studies into that, and not necessarily all relating to AI, but with a lot of touch points to what Lauren just said, and using some of the same references actually. But these are the things I'd like to talk about, a little bit of an introduction into reception and perception, attention and consciousness. Then I'll describe a review I've done with my colleague over the last year or so into a lot of new studies published in medicine and psychology. So these 6 topics I'll just dive into and just give an overview of that. And finally a discussion about if this might be something we should take into account in Pro Audio. But let's get started in our 5 primary senses. So this is exteroception. So this is how we perceive the world around us. And it all started with an old study done by German Karl Köpfmüller in the 60s, where he took a very, you could say, information specific approach to our sensing. So he tried to measure both physiologically how many neurons came into the brain, but also psychologically how much information did we actually get out of all that bombardment. And he came to an interesting conclusion that even though we have millions of neurons going into the brain, this is the maximum we are getting out of it. So this is what he called, in English it would be perceptual velocity or perceptual bandwidth. So a very small amount of data actually being consciously available. And that is, and that's after the second funnel, because we, of course, if we have the world around us, we obviously have a first funnel because we're only seeing certain wavelengths or hearing certain frequencies, and we're only in one place at a time and stuff. So we have an obvious first funnel, but this second funnel inside our brain is very significant also. The other thing I just want to start with here is that we have to differentiate between attention and consciousness, and I'll be using attention as a way of selecting information. So they are quite different, these two. So this is to meet our current behavioral goals, where consciousness is more of a summarizing of what we get from our surroundings and also from our own senses about body status and stuff, but I'll leave that for now. But of course, we are beings, living beings on planet Earth, so all of our senses are sort of related to that. So our composition, that we're based on coal and we have a certain lifespan, a certain size and things like that, all of this, of course, is our prehistory. So what I'm talking about now is the different ways that time affects sensing. So we have time on a very large scale, even going back to evolution, millions of years. We have also time on much shorter time scales. And if we just go back in time a little bit to start with here, very briefly, this is how we believe that the tympanic ear has developed convergently at least 3 times. So we have mammals and humans to the far right there. But so we have this history in our bodies. But all of that, of course, when we are born into the world, we sort of start from scratch. So if we now go to a baby instead and say this is prenatal life here, this is when we are born, then our senses come online relatively early, especially hearing. So the ear is fully developed around 3 months of age, and we can hear around 4 months of age, and babies will start moving to sound maybe after half a year. And when we are born with the ability to discriminate between around 500 phonemes. So all of that is that's already something we have inside of us. So we have the phylogenetic principles where we have the evolution. We have some pre-programming, like we are predisposed to understand or discriminate between 500 phonemes. And then later on, all of that, of course, needs individual learning to be sort of developed further. And it's the same thing that many of our bodily functions, or for instance, our immune system is the same thing, that we have some physical barriers to the outside world. We have some, you could say, general resistance, and then we have some specific resistance that we learn later on. But let's concentrate on hearing or our senses now. So actually already around 2 months of age, babies can start moving their eyes because they localize very quickly. They start understanding language way before they can speak it, of course. And they can typically say sentences around the 1 year old and so forth. But it's also interesting, and I'll come back to that a little bit later, they can actually follow music at an early stage also. This is the other part of it, that there's an action component in all perception. And this is, Lauren mentioned Gibson earlier. This is also, he was one of the first to suggest that action is incredibly important in all perception. So babies, of course, they start reaching out very early, and this is the typical progression for some of a typical development in how they can sort of move around in the outside world. And seeing, of course, is a little bit later, but self-recognition typically happens also around that age. When I say tease over to the far right, that means that the baby at that time typically knows empathy or knows other people and knows what triggers the other person and can play with that. So that's like a cognitive indicator. But let's move on. This is very briefly physiologically the brain from below, and the back and the front, and the brainstem in the middle of the picture. So we have all our senses arriving to the brainstem, and these are the cranial nerves, pair number 1, 5, and 7 here. And we have vision as the second pair, and we have the very important 8th pair here, hearing and balance. And very low frequency hearing is more through the vagus nerve, the 10th pair here. So you could say that our 2 primary senses covering, you could say, space and time would be hearing and seeing. Very briefly on seeing, this is still the brain from below, but now without the cerebellum. So this is how the visual cortex is placed and how it recognizes different parts of the viewing field. But what I want just to point you to here is that the central field is where we have acuity, and that's a very small part of our vision. But the peripheral field is where we register change and movement. And again, this puts a lot of emphasis on movement, but also, of course, that we have only a focused vision in a very limited part of our viewing field. So sensing, broader sensing, you could say, attends to changes, and that's also built into the system. This is the thalamus, sort of the switchboard of the brain. And now if we go to hearing, we have the thalamus here as well. We have the 8th cranial nerve, the auditory nerve entering here at the brainstem, and brain or impulses go up to the midbrain and to the auditory cortexes here. Looking at it schematically, because that's useful for the rest of the talk here, mechanical waves are picked up by the inner hair cells in the cochlea, and then there are only a few synapses. You can actually see the synapses here. So going into the brain, this is the primary path where you'll notice that a lot of things happen before we are consciously aware of it. So we have consciousness to the far right, but all of these things happen ahead of consciousness. So localization and startle reflexes, for instance, happen there. And as we understand it with the other senses, we have this reticular path where the other senses combine, and that's where we do prioritization about what is most important right now. So if we decide that it's hearing, then you could sort of think of it as the auditory cortex being switched into, or we are consciously aware of what's going on in hearing right now. But we should also be aware that what I've just described is what you called afferent traffic. So we have from the outside to the inside. but we have just as much traffic in the auditory nerve going the other way, efferent traffic, so constantly the brain is adjusting the inner ear over frequency selective over a range of 60 dB, so it's very significant what goes the other way as well. I'll look at reviews of these 6 different topics. These are the inclusion criteria, and it's based at the end on around 87 new papers. So the first topic here is the bandwidth of perception, and several of them confirm that the bandwidth is severely limited, and what is called perceptual decoupling is pervasive even in specialist tasks such as pilots. Other studies hypothesize that there might be no real difference between normal perception and hallucinations. It's a question of how much we are anchoring ourselves into the outside world. Cognitive workload, if we are mentally overloaded, then that is reducing perceptual bandwidth further. Latency, this is a little bit trivial that it takes time physically. Of course, we have both the electrical depolarization part, and then we have chemical conductance here in the auditory system using glutamate neurotransmitter. The auditory nerve is very short, of course, so latency is short as well. And then there's some additional latency per synapse. And if we're going back again, of course, we have double the latency. So when we want to have motor actions, we have extra latency in that respect. So we can look at it this way, that we have a stimulus happening at time 0, but we are generally not aware of that if it doesn't persist for a little while. So typically 400 to 500 milliseconds, it has to persist. So if it's a fly that comes and sits on your arm and flies away after 200 milliseconds, then you won't register it. You simply won't feel it. But if it sits there long enough, you will more or less know when it arrived on your arm. And that's what Libet called. He hypothesized that this was, he called subjective antedating, some sort of internal synchronization system that made us resynchronize based on importance. But what we should maybe be more aware of is here that living in the world would really not make sense, or would be very difficult. We wouldn't live very long if we didn't have reflexes to protect us from this latency. So auditory startle and balance, of course, are 2 very important reflexes. So you could sort of say it like this, that our body is in general ahead of our mind. So we have this around 400 milliseconds perceptual gray zone, and it seems that if we want to understand what's happening in this gray zone, we need expert knowledge. So for instance, expert knowledge is to understand the language, because phonemes, of course, what I'm talking, they're much shorter than 400 milliseconds. But the reason why you hopefully understand is that you have trained to do this. It's the same with transients and music and stuff, but we'll get back to that. So there's also in these studies, strong evidence for rhythmic perceptual sampling, so that the latency might actually be modulated further. Short duration sounds. There's a relationship, this is the important one here, between phonemes in music and acoustic information. No, phonemes in language and acoustic information in music. So some of the other studies said that musicians are better at identifying unusual phonemes than non-musicians. And for instance, that subjects that speak multiple languages have increased short-term decoding skills in common with musicians. So there's a lot of commonality between language and speech. Age considerations seem to apply as well, because these phonemic templates are formed very early in life. You remember I said we are born with the ability to discriminate between 500. Within maybe the first 10 years of our life, we sort of lose the ability to discriminate the others. So we have to learn languages early in life. Also, music learning in childhood helps language learning. And this one is a little bit interesting as well, that it seems like the auditory cortex could be associated what you would call with mental timekeeping. So it plays a prominent role in learning empathy and controlling impulsive behavior. So that's a pretty interesting one as well that has been recently discovered. This one, Lauren touched a bit on this as well. I'll talk a little bit more about it in a session later this afternoon, but these temporary threshold shifts are not innocent. That's what new studies show. So we cannot just think that because we have a temporary threshold shift that it won't have any consequence. This is a pretty powerful illustration. I don't have time to go into it, but you can see we have exposure duration on a logarithmic scale and also SPL. So the important thing is that sound exposure is power with time, so that's energy. It's not just SPL, that's relatively irrelevant, but energy is important, and that's what this shows. So you should keep in the white area, or at least not go into the gray areas if you don't want to harm your auditory systems. That's the newest research showing this. Another one that might be interesting for you as audio engineers is that the brain's fastest synapses are found in left-right comparison. So this part of the brain can also fatigue more easily, of course. So if we're listening under unnatural circumstances, this system, it's not that it gets, you destroy it or anything, you just get fatigued. So you sort of start losing the ability to discriminate left and right in a coherent way. This is called the calyces of hell in the brainstem also. Then the fifth one is quite interesting as well. This is sensory reach out. That's also, again, this is one of the things that Gibson also was talking about with vision, and it's been studied since the 60s. Yarbus was one of the first to do it systematically, where these are the ways that we are moving, you could say the focus point of the eye, moving around when we're looking at a bust. So he was one of the first to study that, and it's called saccadic eye movements. So are we passive receivers of information, or are we collecting it? And a vast majority of new studies say that we are collecting it much more than passive receivers. So these eye movements are seen as a general sign of this reach-out behavior. So we are using it to test predictions. So it's like a top-down rather more than a bottom-up model in that case. And different levels of expertise in detecting visual features strongly affect how you move your eyes around. There's also other new studies saying that hearing, explicit detectability in hearing is modulated by rhythm. So that plays an influence as well. And these active sensory behaviors also in other species like sniffing and whisking, the overt ones, so the ones we can register, they follow certain rhythmic patterns as well. Finally, this real-time sensing, we are prone to sacrifice what we're actually sensing if we think, or self-consistency is more important sometimes. And we should consider that as well, of course. So the final one, the sixth one, is unconscious inference, where these things, the perceptual processing, the learning, problem solving, may be, we can do that without consciousness or attention, and sound can unconsciously help. This was maybe also relevant in some of the other studies we have been talking about here, that we can use sound to unconsciously disambiguate something we're seeing. And objects can be attended to, visual objects, without being perceived. Some EEG response studies show that hypersonic sound, which is above 20 kilohertz, can be detected in the brainstem even though we cannot report them. and we are able to understand and learn sounds during REM sleep, even in GCS3, means Glasgow Coma Scale 3, so in a vegetative state, we might still be able to, that's some of the new studies, actually to hear, and even if we wake up from it later on, we might be able to, 20% of the people in that state are expected to actually hear what's going on, even though they can only mentally, of course, respond to what you're saying. They cannot move anything because it's the lowest state just before we're dead, basically. So that's a little bit scary thought as well. Anyway, state-of-the-art perception is very profoundly influenced by prior experience. So the brain is highly active in all sensing. The perceptual bandwidth is much smaller than we tend to believe, and even less in a state if we're in a cognitive overload situation. We don't have, our consciousness does not have access to all results that produce that sensation. Reach out behavior is a fundamental part of all sensing, probably beyond the basic one based on reflexes and stuff. So perception is reach out driven. It might be different from babies, of course, we have to keep that in mind, but when we are grown-ups, this is the case. So discussion relating to pro audio, because of this very small perceptual bandwidth, it takes a very simple conclusion here. It actually takes time to listen comprehensively. For quick assessments, which I call shorter than a year, then we have to keep all variables at a minimum. That's the key. So good mastering engineers, for instance, they know their room intimately. They know their equipment, they know the listening level they're using. They try to keep everything constant except for the content. That's one way of doing it. Listening tests, ABX listening tests, based on only these short duration stimuli and explicit conscious reporting, that cannot tell everything. So especially if you are not completely familiar with the things we're hearing. The unknown artifacts are the worst ones here. So how much time would we need to recognize those? Maybe comparable to, in some cases, comparable to picking up a new language without having a teacher. And subject, the age we're trying to do this might affect it as well. So this could also be important, for instance, with the perceptual lossy data reduction codecs when we are evaluating those. Test designs, how could it affect those? We might divide test designs into 3 different categories. So easy listening, that's where we're not even requiring what I would call the temporal gray zone skills, besides from language maybe. So this could be things like this: loudness, speech intelligibility, immersiveness, basic localization. Trained listening, this is where we might, or where we need these gray zone skills. This is where some specialist training is needed. And finally, the one I'm talking about here, if we have set questions of really systemic relevance, for instance, preservation of cultural heritage or something like that, we should take the time to learn all the artifacts or all the qualities of a sound or what we're trying to investigate. So a little bit more on the discussion side. This is one of my first slides, and we saw that we have a lot of efferent traffic coming back to the senses like this. But question is if we should actually rather think of it this way. So we have, in basic, as adults, this is what happens most of the time. We are reaching out and we are getting a little bit back. This also has if we now remember the child development here, I'll just give you a very brief video here of a little girl who's around 7 months old. And so, and you'll see that, these are sort of what we should note with children, that we should start young. Music stimulates language learning.
learning language stimulates music skills. And maybe the auditory cortexes, well-developed auditory cortexes, is a help in other ways. But this is a little girl here, 7 months old.
Hej.
So she can't really say anything, but she can still move. So she certainly has a lot of reach-out behavior and appreciates the music. So double-blind ABX tests are relevant for many types of studies, but it's not always down to the p-value. So since it is active, we need to know what we're reaching out for. When testing for unknowns, we should have some designs complementary to the ones we're typically using. And if we want to, this is a way of trying to illustrate what art maybe over decades or centuries mean, that we are reaching out, we are getting a little bit back, but what might be common for things we consider as art might be that they're sort of internally breaking this low bandwidth. So they're sort of you could say, developing much more of what we think we are generally getting from the outside world. This is what art in a very short period of time maybe can provide us with. So this is an example of actually a painting from 30,000 years ago in Ardèche in France. So these are humans that have, of course, had their conditions when they grew up, but they still they can communicate in a way that we can appreciate here 30,000 years later. So we have to preserve this, not only visual art, but in the future, hopefully also art we use in music or in other ways we are communicating via sound, and we should make sure that we do that in the best possible way. So thank you for listening, and these are some of my references. We are doing a paper at Tonmeistertagung where there's a complete list. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have any questions? No? I would certainly agree with the perceptual bandwidth. Links in quite nicely with what Lauren was saying. AI could potentially, and objects, reduce that the need for sort of. We're all running consistently with super high bandwidth. We've only got a little bit of space.
Yeah.
The world's becoming noisier and noisier and noisier, and perhaps we should just calm everything down a little bit, whether that's through delivery of less or control of more.
And for instance, these devices also, if they eat our tiny perceptual bandwidth most of the time, that's also a scary thought, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. Yep.
Here's one I made earlier to save time. There is something of a distinction between perceptual bandwidth and sensory bandwidth. And so in part, some of the time you've been talking about sensory bandwidth, the processing of sensory signals, and then you've been saying, but that's not all there is to it, as it were, which I would agree with. Have you come across Clark and Chalmers talking about embodied cognition and stuff?
Yes, yeah. And for the hard problem of consciousness. And
yes.
Yeah.
So they have humans as being proactive predictivores, which is a lovely phrase. Yeah. In other words, there's no sense in which perception is a passive receipt of signals process.
Exactly, yeah.
Another way of putting that is living forms that don't move as much as we do don't have as much perception as we do. Trees don't.
Yeah.
They just don't. So when we test, and I think what you're saying is that when we're testing to see if something is detectable, it reaches threshold, and this, that, and whatnot, we miss the point that that isn't an example of perception how we normally mean it. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that's what I was trying to say. And finding some studies that sort of objectively using fMRI or whatever new types of evoked potentials or whatever. So we can sort of look into the brain in vivo that way, and we have been able to do that for maybe the last 10 or 15 years, much more than we've ever had. So exactly as you say, these are examples of our inner workings, we may never understand them completely, but they're not really what we think they are typically.
Any further questions? Okay, I'd like to thank Thomas again.
Thank you.